Hello, and welcome back to our weekly chats with Les Crowder. We are master beekeepers with over 60 years combined experience. Of course, most of it is Les Crowder's because he's been doing this for about 50 years, about as long as I've been alive, actually. And we are here to answer all your questions. So feel free to ask them in the comments and in Zoom as in YouTube Live, and we're going to admit everybody. And tonight we're going to talk about how to not push our bees too hard. Les, is that correct? What are some of the ways we can leverage the bee biology to get our bees where we want them to be without pushing them too hard? And I see a bunch of people trickling in onto our Zoom. I want to wish everybody a Happy New Year, by the way. Yeah. It's nice to see you all. I see Brad, Deborah, Kathy, Monty's on YouTube, on Zoom tonight. So it's good to have you. Happy New Year, y'all. Sarita, Larry, Ray, thank you for joining us. We're thrilled to have you. I hope that you had a great holiday season. And Les, how was your holiday season?
It was good. It was kind of peaceful, which is nice. My granddaughters weren't here.
Right, so that what makes it quiet, right?
Yeah.
And I've got Richard on YouTube. And so do you want to talk a little bit about the theme for today? And in the meantime, if you guys have questions, feel free. We want to be answering your questions most of all. So we'll run with our theme until we can weave in some of those questions, right?
Yeah, and so, one thing that I sometimes ponder with bees is the house of cards concept. Because really, when you think about it, honeybees require millions of flowers. One hive of honeybees can require millions of flowers that bloom in the spring, early spring, mid-spring, late spring, early summer, for as long as possible. And they need to store up enough of that honey. There's always 17 million things that go wrong, that could go wrong. And in a way, our lives, we take it for granted. We get up in the morning, we step on the floor, we don't assume it's going to cave in under our feet, and we go about our business. Our lives are like pretty much like a deck of house of cards. Any number of things could go wrong. There could be an asteroid, or temperatures can change quickly and things. And so we as beekeepers are attempting to keep these houses of cards up. And in some ways, it's almost miraculous that they do. And then we don't want to balance it too far one way or the other. We would, and my goal has always been bees and flowers have lived together ever since there's been bees and flowers, right? They're mutually dependent on each other. Flowers need the bees need the flowers. Bees cannot live without flowers. Plants cannot live without bees pollinating their flowers. And so when we push bees, or feed bees, or feed them pollen substitute and things like that, we push on that natural balance. And we should do that very lightly and thoughtfully, mindfully. We should be very cautious because, like right now, we're finding out, I just read where Manitoba saying they have a beekeeping Armageddon going on. Many bees died in Manitoba. Maybe near 70 to 80% in some cases. And they had a good fall, but they had a rough spring. And there's all these things that we blame it on. I was just also reading where there's a woman getting bees and analyzing them for stress hormones and stress chemicals. And they're finding the bees are pretty stressed. Now we can blame the varroa, we often do. We can blame climate change or climate change, whatever your view of that is. We can blame a lot of pesticides because they're heavily exposed to pesticides. And so all these things add up, and it puts a stress on the house of cards. It's a pretty delicate house. We need to be careful. That's why we as beekeepers really need to advocate for better ways of protecting our crops besides pesticides. Another thing I was just reading was coffee all over the world is coming under duress, maybe because of heat, but they get a rust, fungus that begins attacking the leaves and eventually kills the whole plant. And now they've found a bacteria that protects the plant from the rust rather than the copper chemicals they've been using, the fungicides basically. And so they're looking into how to better harbor that beneficial bacteria to protect the fungus more naturally. And it turns out that one of the things they have to do is limit the fungicides, kill the bacteria, so that the very thing that would protect the coffee plant is killed by the thing they're also trying to protect the coffee plant with. So this is just where we're entering into a age of biology that is very complex, very delicate, and we depend on a viral and fungal and bacterial mat of creatures even to just stay alive. Like hardly ever do we actually touch the earth. And in plants, even plants hardly touch the earth. They touch funguses that extract from the mineral earth. And so the plant roots go through a layer of fungus to get to the mineral earth. So it's turning out to be very complicated. As beekeepers, when we decide we're going to intervene, even the simple feeding of sugar, if they're going to starve to death, if you don't feed them, you should feed them. But we have to be very careful with that, because, particularly if we light feed and simulate brood rearing, because brood rearing prematurely means that we've taken over the role of flowers, and now we've added a flower to their year, which is a sugar-based flower, and now they can depend on that, and they will. We can breed bees that are very dependent on feeding, just like we can breed bees that are dependent on antibiotics. We can breed bees that are dependent on miticides. We can breed mites that are dependent on miticides. If the mites need us to knock them down so they don't kill their host, and we consistently do it, we're breeding mites that are miticide dependent.
So Brad was mentioning basically to your point, there are a lot of people on Facebook groups that are talking about how much their bees are eating. They're always feeding them sugar bricks and all kinds of things, right? It's like, if you read only the Facebook groups, it would be like, the bees cannot do it without us. They have to have our intervention. Otherwise, they're not going to make it. And I don't think that's necessarily true.
Right. And that is something I often, it makes me kind of mad when people say, oh, we have to intervene and save the bees. A lot of people want to keep bees, and that may help save the bees, but not because they're keeping them, but because they're learning about how to live, or they're changing the way they live as a result of having bees. If you have bees, you suddenly become much more conscious of the use of pesticides. You go out there and you say, oh, wait a minute, how's this going to affect the bees? That's a very good question. It affects all the insects, but we seem to only stop and think about bees because we put money and time and we know we need them. But we may need a lot of insects that we're spraying and don't recognize that we need. So we have to be more cautious and learn to live in such a way that we minimize toxicity. And bees need to be allowed to live as bees. And they're going to live at the carrying capacity of a given area. If I keep 10 hives in a bee yard, that means there's 10 hives worth of food being absorbed. And if I keep too many hives in that bee yard, I am absorbing more food than there is, or trying to absorb more food than there is. But if I only keep 5, that means 5 or 6 or 10 feral hives can exist. I know that when I started beekeeping back as a kid, City of Santa Fe had quite a few feral beehives, and I would get calls to go and remove them. And back in those days, I didn't know any better. I did it mostly for free. I was just pretty much a kid anyway. And so I would do it. And then as I got more and more people keeping bees, we had a whole Santa Fe Area Beekeepers Association get started. And we got a lot of people keeping bees in top our hives. And the feral colonies began to decrease quite a bit. To me, that was a sign that the kept colonies were covering the carrying capacity, and the feral colonies couldn't, we were absorbing all the food for the feral colonies. So at some point, we have to be careful, because I believe feral colonies are a great resource, and bees that are keeping themselves are valuable to us because they become mite resistant, or they don't, then they die. But the feral bees have shown us they have become mite resistant. Then they can time themselves to our individual climates pretty well. Sometimes it's scary, you lose a bunch of bees, and then, but you breed from your survivors.
Right.
And you quickly, it doesn't take that long to rebound. One thing about bees is that they're kind of like two-stroke motors. They roar to life, and then they fairly quickly can drop off and die off. And so we need to keep the ones that are roaring to life, dividing, swarming, making up for the ones. And we're in a time of a lot of change. When I was a kid, my old-time beekeeper friends, they tell me about stories from the 40s when honey was just, they just literally didn't know what to do with all the honey. They were producing barrels and barrels of honey in the desert of New Mexico. And then they said in the 70s, oh, it's getting hard. But in the 70s, it was much easier than it is now. There are areas of New Mexico where it's virtually gotten impossible to keep bees because it's just too dry. And so the climate has changed dramatically, and that stresses the bees. And
Right.
so when we feed pollen substitute, for instance, are we really willing to then take over and become the full source of bee resources? And when does that become better? Like I see this substance they're making, I think it's in Holland, that is going to be just like honey, but not involve any bees. It's supposed to be chemically.
In Israel, I think there's some researchers that have a company, they're calling it some kind of name, and it's basically completely artificial. One of the versions of that is just a basically pre-digested sucrose solution using some of the enzymes that the bees are actually using, which might be a little bit closer to what honey is, but in the end, it's not honey.
Right. And it's not anything like the special nuances of honey that you get from the different floral sources. Like buckwheat honey and mesquite honey and all these floral resources that make very unique and special and delicious honeys that we can never imitate that.
Right. And by the way, if I may, I wanted to kind of jump in real quick. I wanted to say hi to Timothy. Lucian is in the house tonight. It's so cool to have you back, and we are thrilled to have you. Deborah's driving, and she's from Raleigh to the mountains. She says so. She's just listening, and I've got a new listener waking up country because she's got the connection right now to be able to watch it on Zoom. So we're thrilled to have you. I've got Monty's in both YouTube and Zoom, and I've got, well, what else do I have? I've got Richard, our friend that's making the hybrid hive. If you're looking for the Facebook group, the hybrid hive, he's using our Tabar dimensions, but he's using a Langstroth box attached to it to make an easy conversion from one to the other. And our friend Timothy Mitchell, who's in Japan, he was just happy because he doesn't always get the notification. So he's on with us tonight as well. And I want to wish all of you a happy new year, by the way. So I think I might have said it at the beginning, but some of you have trickled in. Sorry, Les, I wanted to kind of jump in and kind of catch up with everybody before I forgot. So
that's fine.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I'm just reminded of one time a friend of mine in New Mexico who used top bar hives, and he said he found he could get free bags of sugar from the grocery store. If they were broken, they would throw them in a big barrel, and he could come and pick up the barrel every now and then, and he'd get a whole half barrel or 3/4 barrel of free sugar. And he was just making syrup and feeding his bees. And I said, why do you need to feed your bees so much? And he said, well, this way, they got plenty to get through the winter. I said, well, but I don't feed my bees at all, and they get through the winter. And he was like, oh, well, I'm just experimenting. Then in the spring, he called me and he said, you know what? I got a problem because all the hives are full from one end to the other with crystallized sugar syrup that I fed him. And he fed them all fall and winter. And they just kept packing it away. And then now he's ready to make divides, but he's got no empty comb. All he's got is combs full of sugar. Plus, what happens sometimes is if the bees contract because of winter and they're not interested in raising a lot of brood, and they leave comb after comb after comb full of honey, they can't protect it from wax moths and hive beetles. So the wax moths and the hive beetles get really going. Often the bees will protect their own territory once the wax moths finish off a bunch of combs, but it's pretty iffy. There's no use in feeding thousands of wax moths in a hive full of bees and hoping the bees can manage, because sometimes the bees will just abscond. So, he overfed and he learned his lesson, and that's fine. But we should all, before we have to do that ourselves, trust the bees for the most part. And then if we go and we look in them, we see they just don't have anything, hardly any honey at all. Okay, we may need to intervene, but and feed them a little something till they can get going. What do I feed? If I can, I feed honey. If I can, I am not ashamed of feeding sugar syrup, but I don't want to feed very much of it. I want to, this time of the year, just feed heavy sugar syrup and just get them through. The thing about here in Texas is we've already got dandelions blooming.
Right.
So we can trust flowers more than we think.
Well, and if you do any kind of emergency feeding, you do prefer the honey, like you said, but the honey, sugar syrup for like prevention of death would be more like of a very thick 3-to-1, 4-to-1, not the liquid light syrup, because it's too much humidity when it's cold. So for those of us who are in the cold temperate climates right now where it's winter, you just don't want to introduce too much moisture in there. By the way, let me circle back a little bit less. I'm kind of like all over the place tonight, kind of going through the comments, but Monty says he started reading Langstroth's book and he says it's interesting how much his mindset was toward managing and controlling the bees, which is probably where a lot of the current attitudes originated. He's starting to see that Langstroth versus hives that support more natural methods. And let's remember that Monty is a specialist in the layence hives, the horizontal layence hives. He's starting to see that the ones that support more natural methods is much more philosophical from the foundation than he originally realized.
That to me is interesting because I believe we're at a time of a philosophical shift. And we're seeing the earth, we can dominate the earth, but we're seeing the results of dominating nature, subjugating nature. And we need to see ourselves more, instead of the designers of and the rulers of, but more as integral parts of and in need of our fellow creatures. Like, we can't live a minute without our own microbiome in our guts and on our skin, holding us together. And we've only recently begun to recognize how important that is. And all the creatures, I would hope that we can pass creatures on, but we have to stop thinking of ourselves at the top of the pyramid, but members of a circle. And it is a very deep philosophical shift. And I'm not sure how it's going to go. Yeah, the time will tell.
Mm-hmm.
But the root of this problem runs very, very deep.
Well, and it turns into the aspect of beekeeping that we all have our own different philosophies about how we do things, right? And this is kind of what's going to inform what kind of hives you're going to choose, what kind of beekeeping style you're going to have, right? The philosophy of some people that want to feed more, they want to produce more honey, they want to just push the bees a little bit harder for profit, for things like that. That's going to kind of influence the kind of hives we're going to go with, especially if you're going to go with pollination contracts and transport those, or if you want to be a little bit less, kind of respect a little bit more the biology of the honeybee and just kind of let them be a little bit more, you're going more towards the horizontal hives and the things that are not as industrial and not as intensive, basically.
Right. And a big thing there is the foundation.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
I feel like putting bees in foundation is putting them in a straitjacket.
Yeah, I agree.
That is really forcing them in a way that has ramifications that we don't fully understand, and that we need to give them the freedom to be bees and to build their own comb. And, like people have told me, well, if you let them build their own comb, they'll build drone comb. Absolutely. They will build drone comb, and they'll use it when they need it. And when they don't need it, they'll fill it with honey or leave it empty. But why are we going to tell the bees how to be bees?
Well, and
let them be bees.
I agree 100%. And I would go even further. Part of the vitality of honeybee colony is to be expressing itself in all its what it was meant to be, right? And the drones, the 15 to 20% of drones that they need, or even the drone comb, not necessarily the drones themselves out of season, but that's part of what makes them healthy. Who are we to kind of decide that we know better and prevent them from growing those drones? If for all we know, we might be really in a way castrating them and just preventing them from expressing their full vitality and being healthy. That might be something there that we don't know.
Right. And so it really does boil down to, can we trust bees and flowers, or do we need to think we are going to replace bees and flowers with the creatures that really, the simplest thing would be then go ahead and just go to that fake honey and just fake food in general. And, that to me is terribly scary.
It's a lack of respect for the creature. We didn't create that creature, and it is meant to function in a certain way. And when we intervene, when we coerce it in certain ways, we're going against its nature. I think it's kind of a shame to not leverage that beautiful vitality to kind of see them thrive without pushing them in corners that they're not going to do well in. I'm sorry, I'm doing two things at the same time. So Aiden's saying, I don't normally feed my bees, and had given the new small hive a few extra bars from the strong established hive before leaving town for a few weeks. And when you say bars, that tells me that's the top bar. So I wanted to make sure that it was clear. When I checked on my new small hive yesterday, they had consumed all of the extra honey bars. So I fed them a 2-to-1 syrup. I was thinking that I should plan to feed them every week to 10 days until mid-February. Okay, this is a great point. I think this aligns with what Les is suggesting. And by the way, if you start feeding them for emergency purposes, you do have to keep it coming, because until the nectar flow really hits, that's not really good. They're not going to be able to pull that off on their own, and they're going to start rearing brood, so their energetic demands are going to increase. So yes, if you commit to this, you're basically committing yourself. The worst you can do is get them started and then stop it completely, because they're going to crash at that point. Les, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, well, it partly depends on where you are. Like we have a lot of dandelions blooming right now, but I don't trust it. We're almost 80 degrees, but I know that we could have another cold snap. And so it's like the hobbits believe in second breakfast. Well, we may have second winter or third winter. We've had that in the past. So it's hard to know what to trust. But once you start feeding, you should feed them a little bit regularly until the flowers really take over. And then quit as soon as you see signs that they're bringing in quite a bit of pollen. I'd still watch for the honey stores on the comb. As soon as you start seeing some honey gathering on the comb, in a couple of combs, then I would drop the feeding and let them transition back to full-on flowers. And it's like, I've quoted Michael Bush quite often saying, if you have an emergency and you're going to need to feed the bees, feed the bees. If you have that emergency every year, it's not an emergency, it's mismanagement. And that to me makes sense, is, don't get them dependent on it. But every once in a while, like you made that hive up late, they didn't have time to build up enough to get through winter. So now that's the consequence. If you want them to get through the winter, you may have to help them a little bit. But hopefully this summer they'll take off and they'll totally be ready for next winter. Right. And on their own, with just them and the flowers will make all they need, and maybe even a little extra. Yeah.
So to confirm, Timothy Lucian was asking, can the bees eat the crystallized honey or sugar? And crystallized honey, definitely, right? Maybe not the sugar crystals that are in there, but they're able to eat the crystallized honey and kind of dilute some of it to a certain extent. But the sugar crystals, that's a bit harder. You need moisture. They cannot chew, right? They cannot even lick it, might be hard for them. So very often what happens is that they'll take it out of the hive as trash and not even use it. But Les, can you remind us what you were saying about the crystallized honey and the sugar for Timothy?
Well, they can definitely eat crystallized honey. One of the things about honey is it's hygroscopic. So the surface of a blob of crystal, because I used to feed this way, set it on a tray or something, just some plain old scraped out of my hive, out of a 5-gallon bucket with my hive tool, blob of crystallized honey. And the bees would consume it quite easily and rapidly and greedily. And it was inside the hive. I never like to feed open feed, because that, you don't know who you're, often you feed the very bees you didn't need to feed, and the bees that need it the most can't compete with those bees and don't get it. But at any rate, we've talked about that before, but they can easily eat crystallized honey. So now, crystallized sugar, I have always used sugar syrup, but I make it as strong as I can make it, 2-to-1, and then add extra sugar, even if it doesn't dissolve, just to make sure I'm dealing with a completely concentrated syrup solution, because that tends to not get moldy or ferment or anything. And then it doesn't release a lot of moisture into the beehive when they get it and start to ripen it. It's pretty close to being the right moisture content that they need anyway. But I've heard people use these bricks, but I assume that they're made with some water and then heated a little bit. You got to be careful about heating sugar, because any fructose can become hydroxymethylfurfural, which is toxic. But So I don't like that. Personally, I just like to stick with sugar syrup.
So thank you, Les, for specifying. And I want to say, Brad was mentioning the best thing you can do, but it takes longer time, right? It's kind of a long-term solution is you have to plant more bees for the bees and kind of plant throughout the entire season, local varieties if possible, so that they thrive naturally. And then avoid the big box stores that coat their seeds or their plants sometimes with those neonicotinoids. Just kind of be mindful of what you plant around. Plant trees. That's like an acre in the sky. We've talked about it before. Bushes next. And then all the flowering plants and wildflowers are great, but they're only very specific short periods of times when they're flowering. Usually, except maybe the vines, they tend to flower longer, and they are not as efficient for the bees to go and forage on. Whereas the tree, everything is in the same location, and this is a one-stop shop. And there's research out there that shows that bees are very specialized when they start foraging on one kind of plant. They try to go back all the time. So trees is the best, and bushes take a little bit less long time to mature. So that's also important. And then you can do the wildflowers, but that's not going to be enough. And talking to your neighbors about that is important as well, because together we rise, right? So we need all of us to plant more for the bees, especially with the disappearance of the natural forage and habitats for not only the honeybees, but native bees or other pollinators. So that's something to keep in mind. Richard says he butchered his question on YouTube, so he joined us on Zoom. But first, before I ask your question, I have a question from Kimmy on Waking Up Country. She says, forgive me, man, I cannot talk tonight. Forgive me for asking. By the way, cedar allergy season is awful right now. There's clouds of cedar pollen and it's killing me. Forgive me for asking, but I'm new to this and I'm in a northern, very cold climate. I was under the impression that you should not open the hive when it's that cold. How would you know if they need it? So by the way, it's 75 and 80s here in Texas, which like Les was mentioning, is unusually hot. Hey, James, it's good to see you on YouTube as well. So Les, what's your take and what do you mean by opening and checking on the bees? So I know with the Langstrasse, you can do a weight test, kind of lift it up and see if it's heavy and kind of evaluate like that. You care to explain a little bit about the top bar hives and how you can open the back and all that stuff?
You can, you don't need to buy, if you left them with quite a bit of honey, if you're new, you can't trust if you left them enough. You're just going to have to trust. If it's really, really cold, it's probably not a good idea to break open the hive and look through it. Now, in a horizontal hive, it's better than in a vertical hive. I don't know what type of hive you have. Is it top bar?
I don't know. She says they're in the negative or single digits there. I don't know. I would assume it's Langstrasse, but Kimmy, you can let us know.
Yeah, leave them alone. Totally. Yeah. When it's that cold, I don't open up beehives. Mm-hmm. What I might do is give them a little heft, but you can't even really feed them in those kind of temperatures. When there's nothing you can do about their problems, there's no use trying to figure out if they have a problem or not anyway. Mm-hmm. If there's some, like, you might think they're queenless, but they might not be, but you can't get a queen anyway, so there's nothing you can do, so just leave them alone. That's where we have to just trust. That's how we set this house of cards up, get it as sturdy as possible in the fall, and then we come through the winter and we see how many of them are still standing. And I hope they're all still standing, but they never have been. Even back in the really easy days, you never had 100% winter survival. There's always a hive or two that would not make it.
Well, and it's the nature of the beast, right? Because in nature, 75% of the newly established colonies are not going to make it anyway. They're not all meant to survive. And they cannot all make it through because, and then if we help them too much, what are we doing? We're really helping weaker genetics coming through winter where they would have been eliminated otherwise, and only the strongest, the ones that had planned accordingly, or had made the right gamble, because bees gamble and sometimes they don't make it through the gamble when they were they had too much brood too early in the season. Well, they might not make it because there's a cold snap, and that kills them off. But so it kind of, to your point, trusting them to do the right thing, and if they don't, then maybe they were not meant to be.
Right. And, I had a woman contact me recently, very near my house here in San Antonio. She had 2 beehives in her backyard, Langstroth hives, and she was worried about them because she hadn't seen them flying near as much as she had in the summer. Well, of course, it's not the summer, but she's new, and so you have to. It's easy to worry. We're good at worrying. So I said, well, it's on the warm day, I'll come over and take a quick look. And we get a day when it was in the low 70s. I knocked on the hive, buzz. I lifted the hive. It was fairly heavy. Well, low 70s, we can open the hive. We opened the hive. There was honey. There was a fair amount of brood, not a ton of brood, but there shouldn't be a ton of brood in December. Should only be a very little bit of brood. The hives were fine. And I understand when you're new at it, you don't know and you worry. Get through a few winters, hope for the best. And pretty soon you'll start developing your own instinct about that. But I totally get it. If you're brand new at it, you just, you're used to thinking of pets. You feed your dog every day, and you give him a place to sleep and everything. So you feel guilty that you're not feeding your bees. You feel guilty because it's cold. But bees have been living in cold weather, and there are bees that are better adapted. Like our bees probably wouldn't do well in your climate.
No.
But your bees wouldn't do well in our climate. So there are bees that came from the mountains of northern Germany that is very, very cold. There are bees that came from tropical Africa. It's very warm. And they all can interbreed and adapt. And we have to sift through all that genetics. Especially here in America, we got genetics from all over the world. And we're sifting through that. And we're trying to come up with a bee that can read the weather in Texas or wherever.
To your point, Les, more than trying to feed our bees or pamper them, baby them, or anything like that, it might be more important to really keep local survivor stock and breed from the strong, cull the weak, and just make sure we have bees that are adapted to our local cycles of weather and forage, because then they'll be able to fend up for themselves. So feeding them, you're actually throwing them off. You're throwing off their positive feedback loops, and in the negative feedback loops. When there's no food coming in, they should know that, right? Because that's part of the information that they use to plan for the next seasons. So to your point about breeding bees that are dependent on food, that's exactly what that is doing. It's not necessarily that it makes the bees dependent on the food, like a lot of people talk about. It's just that it completely throws them off.
Right. People talk about welfare bees, but in a way, Brad's suggestion about planting flowers, that is actually the best thing we could do in the world, because we've taken vast swaths of land and turned it into corn and soybeans with all the asides, pesticides, herbicides, fungicides, acaricides or miticides. And then we wonder what's wrong with the bees. Well, there's nothing to eat. And what there is poisonous.
Right.
So if we could plant hedges and just wean ourselves off of toxicity, the planting trees, honeybees are the quintessential flowering tree pollinizers. A bumblebee cannot pollinate a big flowering tree because it's just going to go to that tree its whole life. It's not going to cross-pollinate the tree. But honeybees, because they're mixing the pollen in the beehive, even though that bee just goes to that tree, she pollinates that tree from all the trees around because she went to her hive and exchanged pollen and got mixed with all the pollen from all the trees for 5 miles in all directions. And now she goes to her tree, she pollinates every flower very efficiently. Honeybees, social bees, are absolutely necessary to feed large flowering trees. And that's what, but then they need large flowering trees to thrive. So we need to plant more trees.
That's right.
Black locusts, linden poplars, any kind of trees that can survive in the weather that we're having. Yeah.
Right. And to Ray's point, he's read that many of the new varieties and hybrids of flowers that look pretty, and that's a lot of those, but they have no benefits for pollinators whatsoever. So they look pretty, but they're basically empty of food. So there's something to look for as well. That's a great point. Thank you for making it. I have a question from George at Iowa Alliance Beekeeping. I think that's his channel. He was asking, what's your favorite Iowa Alliance Beekeeping, George? What's your favorite honey? And why? Actually, that's from Timothy. And then George responded, his bees honeys are his favorite. I agree with you, George, but at the same time, I really enjoy, actually, I've had bad buckwheat honey, but when it's really good quality buckwheat honey, it's actually delicious. So I'm really enjoying that as well. It's kind of like a good whiskey aged kind of a thing. Les, what's your answer to that question?
There is a honey that I used to make in New Mexico in August and maybe into September. It's a desert legume, doesn't have leaves, it has photosynthetic stems. They're slightly bluish green, and it gets dark purple flowers with bright red pollen. So bright red pollen that it would stain the beeswax deep color of an orange, or almost towards red of an orange. Mm-hmm. And it made the most delicious reddish honey. I haven't had it in years because it hasn't bloomed very well in quite a while now. But that, we call it purple sage. It's a bad name because there's so many plants called sage.
Right.
It was a legume, a desert legume, but you could literally smell it when you rode out into the desert or drove out into the desert and the purple sage was blooming. You could smell it in the desert. And it'd be these bright purple blobs of plants. Mm-hmm. Tallest they ever get is about 3 feet tall. But that was always my favorite honey. I haven't had it in years. And I'm beginning to feel a little bit like an old man that brought some honey to a meeting one time that he made in the 40s. And he said, I don't know that I'm ever going to see this again. He never did. He's not with us anymore. He was 80, 30, 40 years ago. So he's long gone. I went to his funeral. But he had yellow top honey where the desert just turned bright yellow back in the 40s. Hasn't done that since. But that was pretty good honey, but still my favorite is purple sage.
There you go. There you go, Timothy. You have it. You have Les Crowder's favorite honey. And we want to know what your favorite honey is, everybody, so that you can just let us know what you prefer. I've got Richard was asking a question. And before I read Richard's question, I wanted to circle back because Monty was commenting that it's his understanding that the solid sugar with which people top feed on the Langstroth especially depends on the inherent moisture within the hive to put the sugar into solution. So yes, when you have frames that don't touch, and you have the vapors from the breath of the bees, the cluster, that contains moisture, and that basically liquefies the outer layer of that sugar brick. And at that point, they can lick it off. So yes, that's correct. Thanks for pointing it out. And you can't really do that very easily in a layence or in a tabar hive because those touch. So layence does have frames, but they touch. And then the tabar hives, the bars touch. So you can't really do that. What I've heard people do is get basically a candy board where they use either a bar or a frame, and they build up a sugar brick in it and put it around the bird's nests for emergency purposes. So you have some of that moisture that's transferring over to the candy board next to it. And at that point, they can lick it off if they need it. But you know what I found, Les, and tell me if I'm wrong, but a lot of times when I see colonies not making it through the winter, it's not because they don't have enough food. It's usually because they have a lower population, or some kind of, or maybe like a barrier for them to get to the food that they needed. But usually that's not necessarily a lack of food I'm looking at. What's your thoughts on that, Les?
Yeah. Well, what I noticed was we have these semi-tropical bees here, and they're very frugal. So when there's no flowers, they cut their brood and they're rearing way down. They live in a little tiny cluster size of a baseball. And that's not a big enough cluster to get to a really cold temperature. So they have plenty of honey. They don't have enough bees to generate a big enough cluster to generate heat. And so we're right at the edge. We're in a semi-tropical area. In the further north, you got more northern bees, like Carniolans, Caucasians, that are build a more robust cluster and can keep warm. But here, sometimes our bees are a little too tropical. Then when we do go to 10 degrees or whatever, they can't take that. And that's just part of being on an eco. We're kind of in an ecotone. We're somewhere between temperate and tropical climate. And sometimes we pay the price for that.
Mm-hmm.
Our bees pay the price for that. And, you know, the survivors that we have will be the ones that built a better cluster and did manage to get through the cold snap. But a lot of bees did hit the cold snap poorly. Yeah.
And then, you know, it's not the end of the world. You can get those resources if you collect them before it gets too warm, and the wax moths get them. And then you can use that for either baiting swarm traps, or making slum gum and coating the inside of swarm traps, or even to give to new swarms as a starting, you know, kit. Hey, you have a couple combs right there. You can get started and not and lay eggs right away. So there's all kinds of things you can do with those resources. Some of that honey you can feed back to bees that need it. So it's always, there's always a positive in some of those sad deaths, but you can make the best out of it. And it's always a learning experience, because it always helps you refine your instinct and understanding of what makes the bees survive and what doesn't.
Go ahead.
Oh, I was going to read Richard's question, but if you had to comment on this, Leslie.
Well, I just wanted to say that the old bee books, and probably many of the new bee books, say never feed bees honey. Mm-hmm. And that is often referring to potential for disease transmission. There may be foul brood or viruses or something in the honey that if you feed the bees honey, you may be transmitting disease. I have never listened to that. I have always fed bees honey. It kind of goes back to when I was a young man, I became a honeybee inspector for the New Mexico Department of Agriculture. And I went to visit an old medical doctor who was a beekeeper. And he maintained that the bacteria that they say causes American foul brood was a putrefactive bacteria, not a pathogenic bacteria. And that he said, try to transmit the disease someday. And so I did. I found a hive full of American foul brood with dead brood, stinky brood, really a bad case of it. And I put a comb of dying brood in a healthy little 4-frame nuke. So I had 3 healthy combs and 1 unhealthy comb. And I came back in a week and checked, and it was about the same, didn't change very much. Came back 3 weeks later. Now the healthy comb looked pretty good. There was no problem with the other combs. Now, I'm not going to say, don't worry about American foul brood and try to transmit it. But the point of being, you can breed bees that are disease resistant. And at any rate, those spores are pretty ubiquitous, just like when they say never feed kids honey, little babies,
Mm.
but the bacteria that they say could be in the honey could also is often on your floor, on your cabinet, everywhere. Clostridium botulinum is a spore-forming bacteria that's virtually everywhere. And to single out honey, again, I don't tell people, oh, don't worry about it, because you never want to, that's a sacred thing to do. You never want to advocate something that might hurt the kid. And a 1-year-old child doesn't need to be started on sweets anyway.
Mm-hmm.
But, I don't worry about disease near as much as a lot of the books say.
Yeah, that makes sense. And usually they're a symptom of an underlying issue, usually something wrong with the quality of the queen, or there's poor nutrition or too much stress. It's kind of like with human beings, when our immune system is down or there's bad genetics or something, then you might end up with problems. So it's not necessarily always the disease that's at stake. There might be something underneath that we need to look into. Anyway, Richard's question is, I butchered my question on YouTube, so here it is. I see a few posts on Facebook about seeing drones in their hives in the past week, and he's in, as you know, Central Texas, where it's warm right now. Isn't this highly unusual? Is it from feeding or less? This is my question along with Richard. Could it be that the bees are seeing a very warm early spring coming in?
I don't know. I've heard from other people that they've seen a few drones. I haven't seen any drones yet, but I have a feeling I know where to look on the east side, where we get more drone activity and just general bee activity on the east side of our territory. And so I'm going to try to check that very soon. But, that's what I'm asking. I need to start a thread of that, because we are now in full-on spring. Now we may get winter coming back again.
Mm-hmm.
Another polar cold snap could come and upset things. But the bees seem to be starting to gear up for spring. And there are some flowers blooming. And that's either encouraging or dangerous.
It's a good
But
sign.
asking me to predict, I don't know.
Yeah,
Seems like the bees are starting to say they're getting ready for spring. I hope they're right. Yeah.
I hope they're right, because they're gambling either way. And then, Richard, what I would say is ask those people that are seeing drones in their hives if they've fed and how much have they fed, right? Because there might be a correlation that you might be able to infer from their answers, something to keep in mind.
The days are getting a little bit longer, but not very much.
Right.
It makes a big influence on bees. Bees like to raise drones when the days are getting longer, just like chickens like to lay eggs when the days are getting longer. And that's why, chicken people who are trying to raise eggs leave the lights on so the chickens don't know the days are getting shorter. But the bees know. But the days are not getting very much longer yet, so it's kind of early.
So Kimi at Waking Up Country, she was asking another nutrition question. How do you feel about pollen patties in the spring to build up the brood? Do you recommend it, or just leave them alone to do what they are meant to? So let me get on my soapbox before Les does, because that's my biggest soapbox item. Feeding pollen patties. First of all, it's not necessarily actual pollen. It might be pollen substitutes. The research out there, a lot of it is showing that it could actually be downright toxic to your bees. It could also create exhaustion in the spring because they are constantly pushed to be brooding up. It tends to make them susceptible to diseases. Some of those researchers, there's I forget the link, but I'll have to look it up and post it. Where the results don't seem very convincing that it brings any benefits. The only time it does bring benefits potentially is when there's no food whatsoever, no pollen out there, and only if you feed them actual pollen, not the pollen substitutes. soy-based pollen patties are actually downright toxic to the bees. So keep that in mind. But then beyond that, you have that early brood buildup. It's kind of artificially created earlier in the season, and it can lead to all kinds of issues. We talked about the potential for a cold snap that might end up with chill brood and killed colonies because they were trying to keep all that brood that was early in the colony alive, or they could go through all their resources trying to keep the brood alive and starve to death. And then another issue potentially would be if they do make it through the weather and the starvation is potentially them exploding and busting at the seams and just basically swarming on you at a time when there's no drones to fertilize properly the virgin queens that are coming online. So that's something to keep in mind. We don't really believe, and I'm going to let Les answer for himself on that, but I really don't believe in feeding pollen supplements for any reason. Very often what happens is that commercial beekeepers that are trying to go to pollination contracts do need to rear their bees in areas where there's not enough food and too much competition, because they put thousands of colonies in one place that has no forage. So they have to feed them sugar syrup. They have to feed them all those pollen patties and get them brooding up so they make size for the pollination contracts and take them out to pollinate almond orchards and all that stuff. So it's a commercial practice that's been adopted, it seems, by a lot of backyard beekeepers that don't necessarily that doesn't necessarily take into account the biology of the honeybee and how they should be following the local cycles of weather and forage, because out of season is not good for them. Les, what's your take on that?
Well, yeah, pretty much reiterate what you said and what Mani said about dominating nature and dominating the bees, manhandling them, so to speak. That if you're going to raise up a bunch of bees and you need them to get to 8 combs of brood for an inspection in California so that you can get a pollination contract at the full price, then you have to build them up artificially and you take them to California and then you release them into a bunch of trees that bloom in February and March and April. That's a whole different situation. But if you're keeping your bees in your backyard, I would really trust the flowers of your backyard and your neighborhood in 5 miles in all directions. They've registered bees or found bees that are foraging 12 miles from the colony. So that's, for a bee, that's a huge distance.
Well, that's a diminishing return at some point, right?
Yeah, it's not a good idea, so to speak. But that has been noted that they can travel that far. But 5 miles in all directions, trust that there are flowers enough that they will communicate with the bees and the bees with the flowers, and they'll slowly build up as the flowers build up, and you'll get into spring, and then summer might be a contraction, or I don't know your climate, but we all have different seasons we have to get through in our different areas. But that's where the bees have to read the flowers and kind of cycle with the flowers. Here, when the flowers decrease, the bees decrease. The flowers increase, the bees can really build up quickly to take advantage of the flowers. And that's nature. That's not, instead of dominating that system, saying, here, we're just going to feed the pollen substitute and we don't need the flowers.
Right.
Saying, let's be in the dance with the flowers and the bees and not do very much, but maybe intervene a little bit here and there. Mm-hmm. A lot of it for our own edification or enjoyment more than that we're doing the bees such amount of good. Again, the biggest thing we can do, like Brad said, the biggest thing we can do nowadays is increase habitat, because we've done so much to decrease habitat. So it's time to terraform the earth, to rebuild the habitat of the earth. Once we do a really good job of that, and life is just oozing out of every pore, and there's thousands of creatures per square meter, then we can start talking about terraforming Mars. Right now, we got to take care of Earth.
Less Crowder on Mars. Who's for that? I am for
I'm
sure.
not.
He would do a good job.
I love Earth very much. I'm not interested in Mars yet.
So Timothy was asking, talking about nutrition and things. You mentioned cedar pollen. Does it have good nutrients for the bees? We have lots of red cedars here in Oklahoma, and some are reporting seeing bees with full loads of pollen. So less. Do the bees make use of the cedar pollen when there's nothing else?
I'm sure they do. We had a similar situation in New Mexico with an introduced species called Siberian elm. It was a wind pollinated plant. It blooms in February. And there's nothing else blooming in New Mexico in February. So they would gather pollen. And it even made a potential business thought to me. Zoologists were collecting the pollen with little brushes and vials. So boy, you could collect quite a bit of it. The pollen trap, because the bees, there wasn't much else in bloom. And you could probably make a fair amount of money with that, but I never pursued it. But often wind pollinated pollen is not nearly as nutritious as insect pollinated pollen. Plants that make insect pollen make a completely different type of pollen that's sticky. Wind pollinated pollen flies. It's light and has wings. It doesn't stick to anything. It flies through the air. And insect pollinated pollen is like Velcro. It sticks to everything. And the plants put extra nutrition in it just to feed the bees, so the bees will gather it and then carry it to other flowers of their species. So I'm sure they get some nutrition out of the red cedar, but then as soon as the better plant blooms, they'll drop it and go to that.
So basically, it's better than nothing. And there's a little article from Honeybee Sweet. I forget what her name is, but she's talking about how honeybees have been shown to collect Alaska cedar pollen. And it's basically not considered high quality pollen as far as the bee nutrition is concerned, but it might be better than nothing. So to your point, Timothy, they might. That might be something they can use.
There's a phenomenon of bees going into corn chicken feed,
yeah,
and picking up corn dust.
That can't
And
be any
once the
worse than
pollen
that.
comes in, they drop it. You know.
That cannot be any worse than that. And yeah, I mean, and there's proteins in cedar pollen, so there's some use to it, but even if it's not necessarily as good in their prime food source. And then maybe if the weather is warm, I don't know in Oklahoma, but where we are right now, it's getting to be pretty warm, and maybe there's things that are flowering that we don't really notice as humans. So but with that, I think I've asked all the questions that we have gone through. Let me see. I want to make sure. I'm kind of lost in my thing. I wanted to share also something with you guys to wish you a happy new year from both Les and I in warmer days. This is at the Paso in Texas when we are just kind of sweaty from coming back doing the bees and all that. And it's just kind of, I want to say, as we have concluded 2022 and we're starting 2023, I am so grateful for you, Les. And I'm so blessed to have you as my mentor, and so grateful that you are able to share your message with everybody. That's a very important message, and I think that it's helping a lot of people. So I want to officially, publicly thank you for all you do and all the people that you've taught over the years. Thank you.
Thank you, Natalie. And I want to thank you. I really, I love teaching and I love beekeeping, but I can't organize things. And you're a great organizer. You make a great team. So thank you.
Well, thank you. Appreciate that. We are also thrilled to have you all, and we're wanted to let you know that we're probably going to take a little bit of a break on the weekly chats. We're going to try to figure out a new format, how to get this going, and just kind of get the message out there a little bit. So, well, next week we're going to take a break and kind of try to refocus. And if you are interested in keeping in touch with us for now, our email address is bemindfulhoneyfarms@gmail.com, or you can reach us at b-mindful.com as always. And then we're going to try to figure out new ways to get things exciting for you guys. So with this, we're thrilled to see everybody, and we want to wish you a happy 2023, and stay in touch, guys.
Thanks. Good. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Natalie.
Thank you. Thank you. We'll see you soon.